Okay, so a very late night stream here in Australia. Basically, the camera decides to go out of focus, right? This is not a drinking tea ASMR, no, but rather it is my thoughts on how maybe the whole ecosphere may look in terms of, the steps in which they'll be rolled out, the steps in which the what liquidity pools might exist on the Ethereum chain, ETH chain, which I call it now, and also PLS chain, Pulsechain. Now, for some reason, I had a mental blank and just wrote ETH chain in my notes. Basically, what I'm thinking now, other people have probably come up with this, but if you are thinking about these sorts of things, you may agree or disagree with these thoughts. Basically, I'll start here. You have the unit side of it before any monetary value is added to it. So what will happen? Well, we can see that US dollar needs to be injected into a cryptocurrency like Ethereum. Now, once that takes place, whether that's through an exchange, whether it's through a stable, what you then see is a liquidity pair. The liquidity pair is then ETH. For instance, you would see like a hex ETH LP on a decentralized exchange that has monetary value. That's what gives it its price, the free market. Another example is an LP with Ethereum and US dollar. Now, so we know that. Now, again, there's many other people in the community that can elaborate a lot further on that, how LPs work. I guess there's even Hart's Law. And the whole reason I thought I'll do this stream is because before I was watching Crispy Man with a great stream, and I was catching up on some replays with ID stream, which made me think, okay, I'll actually sit down and I'll nut this out and go through it. So here we go. Understanding how cryptocurrencies basically get their value. We can then move on from what I just covered and then think about what's going to take place with the airdrop. Now, we know that it's like 10,000 to 1. So for instance, you'll see this is unit only, not monetary value. 1 ETH will most likely give you 1 pulse. Now, we know that 1 ETH equals 1 pulse. We also know that due to the SAC, I'll call it, $1 amount equals 1 point. Is here in my notes. Therefore, you then receive this. We arrive at this conclusion. The airdrop equals 1 for 1. Therefore, therefore, for instance, eHex will equal phex. And for some reason I wrote phxe. I've got like dyslexia or something. My brain fixes it, recalibrates, so to speak. Now, that's that's some pretty basic stuff. Now, I'm sure everyone in the entire crypto space understands this. If you don't, I suggest you look into the mechanics. There's plenty of information out there. It's readily available. It's on the internet. Seriously, look it up. Just verify. Trust. Verify. Don't just trust. As the saying goes. Now, number 2, we have price. We see, like, how does price come to existence? $1 equals, what it equals a stable. Now, you can go into the mechanics of how the stables are derived, whether that be through backed 1-for-1, whether that be through a DAO, whether that be through, an exchange isn't stable that they issue. But basically $1, I would say the objective is for $1 to be equal to 1 US dollar. So I have here in my notes, $1 equals 1 USDC. Then how do we get price? Well, basically you have a trading pair. In a decentralized exchange, you see USDC trading with ETH equals the price due to market forces. Now, on a decentralized exchange, on a centralized exchange, whatever the case may be, you being able to trade $1 worth of fiat into cryptocurrency, being able to inject that energy into the system allows price to exist through free market forces. Exchanges allow this to occur, arguably over the counter, peer-to-peer, all these exchanges, all these transactions allow for price to exist. For instance, therefore, we have, Hex trading with ETH, and every other pair you can possibly think of. Okay, pretty basic, pretty straightforward, right? Now, if the airdrop 1-for-1 with no bridge, you basically will have ratios only. So understanding the units that you'll be holding, understanding the, I guess, if you have 1 ETH, you have 1 pulse, understanding that if someone sacrificed $1, they'll have 1 point, which will, allow them to be holding 1 pulse. So that's a ratio in itself. You then have a ratio on top of that, which is, the potential trades if you have the airdrop that takes place, and if you have the ability to exchange these tokens, this computer code for other computer code through, I would assume, would be a decentralized exchange. However, there is the off chance that centralized exchanges may list. Now, again, that's an unknown. If you ask me, all of this is unknown, but that is a more uncertainty that is uncertain in this equation, in my opinion. Now, because the likelihood of that happening, versus decentralized exchanges existing, you can calculate a lot easier, is basically what I'm trying to say there. Now, this doesn't include the AMM, because you got to think about the process, how it's going to take place, or how I theorize in my mind how it will take place. You'll see 1-for-1 allowing for ratio only. The off chance that somehow a listed exchange decides to trade these openly for fiat will actually inject prices into a system that exists. Now, giving the ability for a decentralized exchange, giving the ability for those tokens, those codes listed on those decentralized exchanges to have a ratio which can be comparable to an exchange amount. If it's a big if a centralized exchange does list any of the tokens once an airdrop takes place, or whatever you'd call this, I'm not even sure what to call it, to be honest. Again, this doesn't include the AMM transactions on the decentralized exchange, so there may be people in the community who understand that a lot better than I. So if you understand the units, how you potentially receive them, if you understand the airdrop versus SAC ratios, if you understand that no bridges into fiat will exist theoretically, then you understand that for a period of time there'll be ratio trading only, and there is, I guess, the off chance that somehow an exchange would list extremely fast, which, like I said, is hard to gauge. Now, this doesn't include transactions which will take place on any AMM for a decentralized exchange. Now, the next thing is, how will price enter the system? Now, kind of touched on that before, but before we do that, in terms of liquidity pairs, so in terms of ETH, ePulse, ETH, eETH, eETH, ePulse, on ETH, and then on Pulse you'd see PLS, ePulse, eETH, ePulse, PLS, eETH. Now those 6 I guess LPs, not including single-sided staking or anything like that, or single-sided whatever you're going to call it, is what I envision taking place. But I'll stick to what I was, the notes and the process, the way I thought it through in my mind. Now, understanding that, I guess you have these questions to ask and to answer. You have, step 1. I call it step 1, but arguably there's other steps, but just in this case, there's 3 steps. Receive, we'll call it the airdrop. Receive the airdrop, right? Equals ratio. What I mean by ratio is you receive the airdrop, assumption is exchanges are open, ratio trading will commence, I would say. Assuming everyone just doesn't do anything. Now, step 2, once in position, because you gotta understand that if you ratio trade or you don't ratio trade, then the question is, what's next? What's next is, are you in position? Because once you're in that position, whatever that may be, there'll be a bridge or a fiat via exchange, which I mentioned before. But this is step 2. Because once the bridge opens, or a bridge opens, or however it's going to take place, if when, it's the same with fiat exchanges, you'll then be in the 3rd and final position. Now, the 3rd and final position is the LPs, and this will set the price, and then from there, the free market will take place. So, I guess to drill a little bit deeper into that, you'll see a bridge open. Now, in this example, I guess what I'm trying to figure out is what will push price into place. Now, before I continue here, if any of you played with V2B, I'm a bit strange. I do things backward. It's almost like I tend to reverse engineer things first and then go forward. So I'm not sure, maybe people are trying to earn, maybe they're trying to single-sided provide LP, maybe they're trying to create LPs to get incentive tokens, maybe they're trying to lock, burn hex to try to get more hex, or maybe they're playing with some other systems in place that are strongly bound to or derived from T-shares, which are all amazing. Maybe they're just trying to pure ratio trade, I'm not sure. So the first thing I tried to do, one of the first things I tried to do was, when the bridge opened, was use PLS to bridge back into ETH. Now, I think it was on the Ring-B testnet, so I'm actually not sure how it works. Like the creation of the ETH Ethereum on that network. So I was actually able to go to a bridge, and the first thing I did was try and figure out how much ETH I'm now holding, because I was able to ratio trade, all this pulse into ETH, which led me down this train of thought, because something happened, it was changed, and I can't remember if I created some liquidity pools, and there was only a limited amount of liquidity pools, because the ability to actually, which led me to think, how would you inject price into the actual system? Because if you don't have the real Ethereum, although there was Ring-B Ethereum to inject price in, how do you inject price? So there must be a third variable. So this third variable I was thinking about, sorry, not a third variable. The bridge is the third variable. So I went back and looked and found, if you are trading across the bridge, you have basically, the assumption will be 1 ETH. So this is on Ethereum. 1 ETH will be equal to 1 eETH. Just as 1 eETH will be bridged over and will become 1 ETH, going to and back and forth across the chains. Now, if you have PLS, basically you'll then have ePLS. And then if you have ePLS, you'll then have PLS. Now, this allows for the bridge to work. So again, not an expert in bridges. I'm not sure if the actual liquidity needs to be there for these pairs to take place. So imagine if some huge player comes in and tries to extract into the system or out of the system a very, very large amount. People following that may be stuck pending whatever it is. Again, maybe that's part of the AMM bot, and the bridges I'm not actually sure, but just keeping in mind at the bridge point you have this ability to go to and from ETH to Pulse. So looking at it from the ETH side, ETH chain, I don't know, I keep calling it ETH chain. Looking at it from Ethereum, you can inject fiat into Ethereum. You can then liquidity provide between Ethereum and another bit of code. You can then bridge across from Pulse into Ethereum. You can then sit on Ethereum in theory and have the AMM take place, which allows for LPPs to take place. The LPs will then be able to inject their ratios into the Pulse bridge, which continues this back and forth between Pulse and Ethereum. Now, I find the bridge is key because there is an unknown, in my opinion. Again, someone else might be able to verify this out there. What you'll see is on ETH, I would imagine on a decentralized exchange, assuming there's no exchanges that are going to actually list this, what you will see is a trading pair. Now, it's not overly complex, and other people have probably explained this, but I just thought I'd put it on the record for my thoughts, what they are. Now, if you have ETH and ePLS, that is most likely going to be a trading pair. This is on Ethereum. You're most likely also going to have ETH and eETH, another trading pair. You're also most likely going to have eETH and ePLS on Ethereum as a LP pair. Now, this will be after the bridges take place. There'll be lots of other trading pairs that will exist as well, because basically you'll have all these free tokens, and then it'll be up to the individual to decide what to do, whether or not there's an AMM bot that does this as well. I'm actually not sure if it will be doing it on the Ethereum side, but as above, so below. As you see here, moving on, I could probably put together some slides, however I haven't, because I thought, my mind works best at night. Now, you see on Pulsechain, most likely you're going to have LP pairs. Pulse with ePulse, eETH with ePulse, and Pulse with eETH. So these are going to exist in my mind as I've thought through, as I've theorized. Basically, once the bridges open up, injecting a price into the system, most likely, because I'm guessing the first thing that's going to take place is that AMM bot. You'd hope that the AMM bot gets in there first, and then once that takes place, you basically have prices, and they're subject to free market. I was going to say free will, but it's actually free market, which arguably could be because of people's and their choices and their free will. Now, when you see ETH chain pairs with these prices, it'll then be up to individuals to be providing liquidity for these pairs on both the ETH side and both the Pulsechain side. You will see people with, I'm assuming, lots of Pulse pairing with Ethereum, which they may not have as much Ethereum. So that's going to be interesting to watch, because like if there's not as much volume as you've seen on some of the not ghost chains, but Ethereum proof of work, Ethereum proof of stake. There's another one, Ethereum Fair. Sorry, ETH 2.0 is not one. Ethereum Fair. Over on those chains, I haven't looked too closely, but because there's not as much activity, although there is a exchange open to provide and inject liquidity into it, and there is decentralized exchanges, but you're not seeing the liquidity being provided on both sides, and maybe that happens with Pulsechain. However, to me, another unknown, on top of the exchanges actually listing and being able to provide a price on the free market, allowing people to then ratio trade that, allowing for an equilibrium to be found or the free market to take place, is the way that AMM bot will, I guess, directly impact the system throughout Pulsechain, on Pulsechain, potentially on Ethereum. I'm not actually sure how that's going to work, because yeah, like I said, I paired up these three because I thought, well, if I can come up with Ethereum ePulse, Ethereum eETH, eETH and ePLS, you can sort of see based on them what the prices may be, because you understand. Well, the assumption is, you know, one actual Ethereum will equal one eETH, you know, on the on Pulsechain side. So you would have eETH on Pulsechain side, which you could bridge into Ethereum, and you could exchange one for one. It's not initially as I thought, which was, as again on V2, you were able to exchange Pulse, like one Pulse into one Ethereum, which would be insane. If that worked, that would be insane. You'd literally potentially have more Ethereum than should be in existence by a factor of 10,000. But going back to this now, if you then analyze it and look at so you're sitting on Ethereum, Pulsechain, and you have one eETH, you can then trade that for Ethereum on Ethereum. Now that's why I call it ETH chain. But the opposite is true, and so if you're then sitting on Ethereum, right, and you have ETH, and most likely if you have a lot of Pulse, you're gonna want to create a liquidity pair on ETH chain potentially. I mean, I don't know if you'll do this, but if you had, say, a lot of Pulse, and you had some ETH, maybe you're providing a liquidity pair there to get some rewards, you know, on the ETH side. But it's more expensive, mind you. But it is an option, because think about it: if that side's completely dead, how are you going to be bridging in and out with these LPs? Maybe you bring everything over to Pulsechain, but I'll get to that next. So this is just sort of impromptu stuff. Now, you're sitting on ETH, and you then also maybe, if this sounds silly, but you maybe are going to be providing a LP between ETH and eETH. Now, I'm not sure if eETH will be able to exist on a decentralized exchange, because it's the equivalent of, you know, wrapped Bitcoin, wrapped BTC. But because, you know, it actually can exist on Ethereum, it's technically possible, because you can't provide liquidity on a decentralized exchange at the current time with Bitcoin and Ethereum, because they don't communicate with each other too well. But you could if there was you know, Ethereum itself, and you wrapped it, and which then became eETH. So I don't know if there's going to be a bridge that actually creates eETH as well, which is another interesting concept, because, you know, how would you get eETH? You'd have to wrap ETH for it to become eETH, but then this is what I'm saying, you would then require a bridge to move from Pulse into Ethereum. but the pair, like Pulse doesn't then equal ETH. One Pulse, it doesn't equal one Ethereum. So therefore, you'd be sitting with on Ethereum as an LP pair, ETH and ePulse. You know, ETH and eETH, if that was a thing, if there was a contract or a bridge that wrapped ETH to eETH to then move across bridges, you know, would be a pretty trippy function, because if you're providing liquidity, I'm not sure how many fees you'd get from that one. Lots, not much. I'm not sure. You know, like, or would it just be a function of the actual bridge? Just thinking about this one now. The other one, as I said before in my theory, you know, you have eETH because you've obtained eETH, and then you'd be providing potentially liquidity with ePulse. Again, because you move one pulse across the bridge, one pulse on Ethereum equals one ePLS, you know. So therefore, there would be a trading pair or a liquidity pool with, hypothetically, ePulses and eETH, because if you can get eETH, then you could pair it with ETH. Now, the reason I say that is purely because on the Pulse chain side, you have Pulse itself, and again, it sounds silly, but you might have ePulse. So maybe there'll be a way to actually wrap or turn Pulse into ePulse. Now, this sounds silly because it's like, hang on, if you're on Pulse and you've got one Pulse and you've got one ePulse, they should be 1 for 1. True, but if you're moving Pulse to ETH, it's not going to be turning into ETH. It's most likely going to be turning into ePulse, or something that recognizes as ePulse, which would then, you know, allow for ePulse to exist. Because if there's a bridge, for instance, that turns Pulse into ePulse on the Pulse chain side, as you can see, it gets very interesting. Now, again, point out this. Let me know if this is incorrect. There may be other pairs I'm not thinking of, but these are the ones that I feel will exist. The next one, you'll see on Pulse chain, eETH. Now, why would eETH exist? Because, you know, oh, sorry, going back to the price on Pulse ePLS. Now, that'll be unknown. The prices will be exactly the same in theory. I guess people are playing around with the trading or arbitrages or something. But assuming the system allows for bridging between ePulse and Pulse, I mean, it should allow, obviously, or it should allow for Pulse to exist on Pulse chain. But the question is, to move Pulse to Ethereum, will it be actually, you know, ePulse on Ethereum, which would then be, you know, redeemable, I guess, on the bridge for one ePulse, which will be ePulse on Pulse chain, which arguably should be PLS, but if it's wrapped and turned into ePulse, ePulse isn't allowed to trade on Ethereum, which would be, you know, redeemable, I guess you could call it, or exchanged on a bridge, which will allow ePulse and PLS to exist as a liquidity pool, which would be very interesting if this takes place, in my mind. It might be simpler than this, I'm not sure. Or the bridge might have a different way of actually functioning. Again, maybe look into that if you're more into bridges. So that's how the price, I mean, should function on that. You know, one thing on Pulse chain should equal basically the same thing on ePulse. I mean, you could factor into fees. You could factor in to the price fees on one chain versus the other, but like, I'm not sure people would be trading one Pulse on Ethereum for much, because most likely the price is going to be a lot lower to start off with relative to Ethereum. But for the prices to exist, the LP pools to exist, ePulse has to exist in my mind. Now, eETH also has to exist, as does a trading pair with ePulse. As I said, if ePulse exists, then so too will eETH. in a trading pool, because eETH will be, what will eETH be? Now eETH will be Ethereum but on Pulsechain, because again, Pulse can't go directly into ETH. It can't be like a fraction of it, even though directly it's a fork of the code, which it may recognize as it, but you want to be able to identify what is actually what. So if you had, again, if you weren't able to do that, you might end up with some dilution of Ethereum, because you'd essentially be able to produce 10,000x more Ethereum than should be in existence. Now that's not what's taking place. Getting back to this now, Ethereum, because if eETH exists, so say you have Ethereum and you bridge it over to Pulse, you would receive ePulse, or maybe there's a function, a mechanism which allows eETH to be wrapped and turned into ePulse. Now that would allow for a LP pair to exist on Ethereum, which would be ETH and eETH. It so too would allow for the function of eETH to be moved over to Pulsechain, and it would appear as eETH, and that would be redeemable on ETH for like 1-for-1. So therefore on Pulsechain you'd be able to create a pair in this theory with eETH and ePLS. Now again, why not PLS? As I said before, because you would, unless the bridge automatically knows how to do this, which would be like almost like a three-way arbitrage. In my mind, it would be eETH and ePLS as a trading pair, because as I said before, to trade PLS on Ethereum, you would have a wrapping mechanism, I would imagine, which would allow for ePulse to exist on Ethereum, and then which would be not redeemable, but which would be able to move across bridges, multi-bridge, which would allow for Pulse to be on Pulsechain, and a representation of Pulsechain to exist on Ethereum, which would be required for trading pairs to exist in decentralized exchanges, also centralized exchanges which want to trade this. The price on that would be, the bridges will have to open, fiat would have to be injected into the system, allowing free market forces to take place. The price would most likely, one eETH is going to be equal to Ethereum. So you then have one ePLS, which would be, you could say just move the decimal to get the price, but that may not be what takes place. Again, there could be buying pressure, or you could see, people trying to capitalize if bridges are open to be able to try and start redeeming their Pulse for Ethereum, and almost extracting value or perceived value from Pulsechain back into Ethereum. It's quite possible. But yeah. The next one is I assume would exist, or I theorize that would exist, is Pulsechain, so PLS on Pulsechain, so yeah, PLS, and eETH. So that would allow this, that would allow eETH to exist on Pulsechain. You could then bridge across, so one eETH would be worth one ETH, vice versa. But also the eETH would have to exist on Pulsechain to be able to create these LP pairs. So that is the way I see it working so far. And then you would have people with large bags of Pulse, and then they would be deciding how to provide liquidity and where to provide liquidity. So whether or not the AMM is able to do it on the Ethereum side will be interesting to see. It'll be fascinating to see, because think about it. You have one Ethereum, and you try and bridge it across. How are you doing that? Do you wrap it? Then if you wrap it, it's still on the same chain. Then once you wrap it, it's on the same chain. And you have a bridge. You move it across to be able to, trade on the other chain under the same ticker. Most likely. So if that is, and then I should probably write this down. Then, if that theory is the case, with Ethereum and Pulsechain, then this would reign true for other ticker symbols as well, because it may not be what might be, I'm not sure, but it may not be that we could use DAI as an example. So on Ethereum you'd have DAI and eDAI. Technically DAI would be worth 1, but then you'd need a function to wrap DAI or turn DAI into eDAI, which then would that would be insane. Automatically you'd think, oh, it'd be worth 1 for 1, but at most it might not be, because it would happen actually. That is very interesting. All right, I'll continue on. This is off the top of the head. So if you had you know, a stable coin token code that was something like DAI, and you want it to represent the amount on Ethereum, you'd have the normal ticket. If you then had a function to turn it into eDAI, you know, eDAI would then be its value on Ethereum but represented on Pulsechain. So in that instance it would actually be 1 for 1, because the theory is it would be, you know, 1 DAI versus equals $1. You wrap it, it then becomes 1 eDAI. You then bridge that over to Pulsechain. Lo and behold, you then have injected a tradable pair, assuming there's enough liquidity, because everyone saw what happened when there was like 1 tether or some shit and someone tried to trade like $1 million against it. The bot just raped it and took all the value out, and someone ended up with $1 or something. But so that's not what I shouldn't have said that. That threw me off a bit. Basically that would equal then 1 eDAI, injecting money into the system, and then assuming there's enough capital in liquidity pools on both sides, and people bridging and the bridges aren't clogged up, you would then, you know, see the free markets then begin to do their thing. And again, assuming centralized exchanges do not allow for purchasing and selling of like Pulse or ePulse or anything like that. Now in this theory there's also Ethereum, and there's also, so in the example of DAI, you then have the pair between DAI and eDAI, which I don't know if you guys remember, there was a stream saying people could take, you know, maybe they've been just freshly airdropped token with their existing token. You could then pair those two together, and then if you pair those two together, maybe you could provide liquidity. Then also if there's the ability to then move them across the bridges, or a bridge or bridge, I'm not sure how it's going to work, you would then be able to see injection of price into systems that previously had none. So if you had, for instance, DAI on Ethereum, you'd then potentially have a liquidity pool with eDAI. Again, this would be silly. It sounds silly because they'll be both worth the same thing. Next, you would have eDAI, so which would be like, because you've created the eDAI, because potentially you've wrapped it on Ethereum chain still, and the mechanism I would imagine would be 1 for 1, because you don't want to like sort of create double the existence of the token you're looking at. So that's why the wrapping would be required of some sort of bridge, whether that be through a function of the bridge or a separate function, I'm not sure. But then you can hold on the Ethereum chain, you have eDAI, which you could then pull against something like ePulse. Now ePulse, sorry, you could then pull that with eDAI, with like eDAI on Pulsechain. So that's where it gets pretty confusing. So you've got DAI and eDAI. What would you call it? Hang on. Lost my train of thought there. So in the theory, in this theory here, you would have DAI itself. you then have the equivalent of the trading pair. So maybe the trading pair is Pulse. Will the trading pair be Pulse? Let's have a look. You'd have DAI, the trading pair, and then you'd have eDAI as like trading against itself on the Ethereum chain in this example. Now, what would be the representation for ePulse in the instance of eDAI being ETH? What would it be? It would be ePulse, because ePulse is the representation of one pulse, and you bring it across onto the Ethereum. So you would have ePulse. So I rambled on a bit for incorrectly before. Apologize. Now you then have DAI ePulse as one liquidity pair. You then have DAI eDAI, which would be the same thing because you've turned DAI into eDAI, allowed it to function on both chains. Mind you, and when you turn DAI into eDAI, you're locking it up. So that's why this pool would exist, because people potentially would either be. That's interesting. People would then be trading it, assuming there could also be a locking function or a contract of bridge. Again, this is why this is hypothetical in theory, in my mind. And then also you would have, the E version, the Pulse version of DAI, which would be eDAI in this example, trading with the ePLS version. Now, why is that? That's because that's like a part of giving value to the chain, which is Pulse chain, because the value has to exist somewhere. And if you are able to, if this didn't take place because the bridges weren't open, or a mechanism that allows you to wrap a Pulse chain token or wrap an Ethereum token to be traded on Pulse chain, representing an E, in front of it, then no price would ever be able to be found in the Pulse chain, because basically it would be similar to the V2 with all the tradable pairs, because currently I haven't looked at V3 recently, but I'm pretty sure there's very limited. LPs, the only one I've seen is Pulse X, which makes sense. But yeah, I'm not even sure this is like a thing. It's just in my mind. So then if we work it, we do the DAI example. So say you have Pulse chain and DAI. You would then be looking at, what are we looking at? So yeah, you'd have Pulse DAI. So basically the exact same three pools, but on Pulse chain, but reversed. So instead of DAI ePulse, DAI and eDAI, and eDAI and ePLS, giving a value, you then bridge it over into Pulse chain. You would then see, you would see the representation of DAI on Pulse chain, which would be LP between PLS and eDAI, which would have to be graded on, technically on Ethereum as well as Pulse chain for it to exist. It would have to be wrapped, and then that way you can trade across. Not sure how that would happen, as I said. You would then also see a trading pair, which is eDAI, which again is that wrapping function, or the equivalent of DAI that can exist on the opposite chain, which can also be traded on the native chain in which it exists. You then see that traded again with ePulse, because ePulse would be required to inject price into the system, because on Pulse chain, how else are you going to bridge it across? Because when you bridge it across, it's not going to become ETH. When you bridge it across, maybe before the bridging takes place, It then gets wrapped, turns into ePulse. Then on the ETH chain, you have a representation of ePulse, which then you can create pairs on. Now, again, I could be injecting another subset, which is not needed, because when you move ePulse back to Pulsechain, it might just be Pulse. But if that's the case, maybe, as I said, it depends on the bridge if there's a wrapping function first, which is going to be pretty interesting to see, because this is the way I see it taking place. You would see Pulse itself on Pulsechain with a trading pair of eDAI. Again, this could all take place, thinking out loud, thinking as I'm going along, excuse me, this could all take place as a function of the bridge. So you might see Pulse to go on to ETH, basically wraps, turns into ETH, ePulse, and on Ethereum, you would see, you know, this representation. If that's the case, you could basically cross out the pairs, which are pairs of themselves, because that function could actually be taking place on the bridge, which would be pretty damn interesting, because that would mean in that situation you would see, so if you're moving back to the Pulse ETH example, so you're seeing PLS move to ETH, say the assumption is you're not going to wrap PLS and turn it into ePLS to move and appear, have a representation. So basically, so if you're on Pulse, you're not going to be able to see you're not going to be able to see ePLS. But if you can see ePLS, then that would mean LP providers can take place. That is my thoughts. That would require, though, in my mind, either a smart contract or a bridge, a pre-bridge bridge. So I'm not sure. Again, I'm not sure about any of that. That was just in my mind as I thought it through, and I thought I would go on stream and just talk about it. The idea that you would have on Pulse, ePulse, may sound silly, but in my mind, if that is the case, then you could create LP pairs between them. But I'm not sure if that would cause any weird vulnerabilities, or if, you know, or if that's even a thing. Maybe this is just something I've made up in my mind. Who knows? But yeah, that's about it. Thank you for tuning in, anyone that did. But yeah, I thought I'd share that with the world.